Chapter 7. Isabella was perched on Maggie's hip, Peter on Keith's, as the four of them walked into the little church on the other side of Pine Hill. Keith hadn't been in this church in a long time. When he sat down in the bench and put Peter on his lap, Keith's gaze went to the front. In his mind, the casket still sat right there. With barely a sigh, he was right back there, the incomprehension, the sadness, the fear wrapping around him. Stoicism dropped into his heart. He wouldn't cry. He hadn't then, and he wouldn't now. At that moment, Maggie looked over at him and smiled. If he'd had only a small amount of sanity less, he would have reached over and taken her hand. He knew what that hand felt like in his. It was wrong, but he wanted to feel it again and again, forever. Hardly smiling at her, he turned his gaze up front. He could do this. For her, he could do this. He needed to, if only to pay her back for giving him a piece of himself he had lost so long ago. Bowing his head, he let his mind go back to the memories waiting there. Her perfume, her gentleness, her tenderness. His heart filled with the memories of the woman who had shaped him into the man he was today. "I'll be back, Keith, I promise," she said again in his memory, and he had no trouble at all recalling that voice. "You be good while I'm gone." Emotion surged to the surface, but he beat it back. He hadn't done the best of jobs of keeping that last promise. He had tried, but it wasn't exactly the easiest assignment in the world. The service started, and Keith stood Peter next to him. Once on his feet, Keith glanced over at her. With Isabella on her hip and God in her eyes, Keith wondered how much she looked like his mother surely had, standing in this church with a little tow-headed boy standing right next to her. He put his hands on the bench ahead of him and arched his shoulders forward. She had been gone for 17 years, but to him, she had never really left. "You want to stop somewhere and eat?" Keith asked when they were back in the pickup. Maggie turned to him pensively. "We'd probably better get back. I'm sure lunch will be waiting." "Yeah, right." It took him more than a minute of driving before he got the emotions firmly put back in their place. Then he glanced over at her. "So, what do you say? Horseback riding tomorrow? We could go out to the waterfall." "Waterfall?" "It's not bad. Real easy ride. The kids will love it." His heart was now talking for him. "We could take a picnic, spend a few hours, let them play in the water. It's supposed to be nice tomorrow." "I don't know. Inez might—" "Let me worry about Inez." Maggie looked over at him, obviously still not convinced. "You don't think they will be mad?" He didn't really care what they would think. Nah, it's one day, one afternoon. How could they get mad about that? Maggie did her best to have everything ready Monday morning, but life wasn't cooperating. Peter seemed to have grown 2 inches overnight, and suddenly nothing fit. She would have to mention that to someone, the prospect of which did not sound inviting. Isabella was not in the best of moods, and Maggie wondered if she might be getting sick. There were no real, solid signs, but a general lethargy that seemed to drag on the little girl's spirit. "Are you not feeling good?" Maggie asked, and Isabella looked at her from the changing table with wide eyes that told her no more than she already knew. "Well, I think swimming is out for you today, little one." With the child's clothes changed, Maggie picked her up and turned Peter for the kitchen. "Let's get some breakfast. We've got lessons to get done before Keith gets back to take us riding." Her heart bounced on the mention of his name. Church the day before had been so wonderful. It was strange because she wouldn't have pegged him for a churchgoer, and in truth he had looked rather out of place. Yet he took her because he knew she wanted to go. Something about that made her heart dance. At breakfast, he was normal Keith again, down to earth, nice, and work-focused. Ike called again, Apparently they had made it back from the race. Cumane had gotten third. She couldn't tell how he felt about that. In fact, information about reality was having a hard time crowding out information about how her heart felt every time he was around. He stood from the table and grabbed his hat. "I'll be back about 11. I talked to Inez. She'll have lunch ready to take." Maggie nodded, watching him and wishing she could stop time. Here in the breakfast area, him standing there, hat in hand, life felt so right, so perfect, and she never wanted that to end. "We'll be ready." Ready they were, standing on the top step as if they belonged nowhere else. Keith had to pull in a breath before he could hit the door with his shoulder to get out of the pickup. Ike would never understand, but that was okay. They had today, and right now to Keith, that's all that mattered. "Who's ready to go riding?" he asked, as his heart soared ahead of him up the stairs. "Me!" Peter jumped from the step into Keith's arms. He was happier than Keith had ever seen him. "Well, what are we waiting for?" They got the kids into the pickup. Maggie crawled in the front, unlocked her seatbelt. "I don't think we're going to get to do the water thing." "Oh, why not?" "I don't think Izzy's feeling all that great." Keith looked back into the seat behind Maggie. "Why not?" "I don't know. She's just not herself this morning." The concern was evident in Maggie's demeanor. "You think she needs a doctor?" "No, not yet anyway, but I also don't think she needs to be inviting a cold either." He had yet to put the pickup in drive. "You still want to go?" She smiled at him. "I think the sunshine will do her some good." Her gaze fell to her jeans. "Besides, who knows when we'll get to do this again?" The melancholy of what happened tomorrow hung over her, and with everything in him, Keith wanted to make it evaporate. "Then, we'll have a great day today, and let Jesus take care of everything else." Surprise jumped to her face, but when she looked at him, he smiled. After a couple seconds, she nodded. "Oh, it's beautiful." They were the only words Maggie could think to say when the horses approached the waterfall. The shelf of rock high above dropped the water over its edge like a hand dropping pearls. In the bright sunlight, the water glinted and glimmered like 1,000 tiny diamonds. Her gaze stayed on the falls as she got off and pulled Isabella down too. "Oh, baby girl, look at that! Look how pretty!" "Pity," Isabella said, and happiness burst through Maggie. She nosed her face into the soft blonde curls. "You are the cutest thing ever, you know that?" "Come on, you two," Keith said, tilting his head and smiling at them as he stood there, the basket in one hand and Peter's hand in the other. "You're wasting daylight." Through the calf-high flowers, Maggie stepped over to him and followed him right up to the second shelf of rock, which stood between the fall above and the pool of water below. Carefully, she sat down. "This is incredible. I've never seen anything like it." "One of the hidden treasures of the place," Keith said. "The drive up is murder on vehicles, so most people don't bother to come out here." "But the horses didn't have much trouble," she said with concern. "No, luckily they're open accessed out here." Kneeling, he started laying out the picnic: sandwiches, potato chips, and little silver bags of juice. Maggie wondered if he would die of starvation before they got back. She'd seen him eat, and this didn't look like nearly enough. "You come out here a lot?" "Not much anymore. I used to come out here a lot." She helped him and then set Isabella on her lap and tore her a piece of sandwich off. "What happened to that?" He shrugged. "I got busy. Things to do, people to see, places to go, you know how it is." "So they keep you pretty busy, huh?" She took a half sandwich for herself. "Always something. They'll be taking Cumane to Del Mar in a couple of weeks, and we're trying to get Transistor and Dragnet ready, too." Maggie laughed. Where do you come up with these names? They sound like some kind of sci-fi aliens or something." Keith smiled. "Well, some come with our own names if we buy them somewhere else. Some we come up with on our own if we've bred them in-house." "In-house?" "From our own stock. You breed them so the mare's qualities complement the stud's, and, hopefully, you get a racehorse that's fast as lightning and strong as an oak." He was feeding Peter. She was feeding Isabella. "That's not always easy, I take it?" she asked, fascinated by the topic and by his apparent knowledge on the subject. "No, it's not that easy. Sometimes, instead of the best of both worlds, you get the worst of both worlds. Then you've got a nag that has the manners of a spoiled brat." She laughed. "You've had a few of those, I take it." He scratched the bottom of his chin. "More than our share, but we're learning." "We're?" "Me and Ike, the trainer." She lifted her chin in recognition of the name. Ike, the 50-something guy who, although way out of her age bracket, was still the gentleman every girl dreams about snagging. "You guys get along pretty well, huh?" "He's like a second father to me." Keith's gaze faded from her out onto the falling water as he chewed his sandwich. "I loved horses, couldn't get enough of them, and Ike took me under his wing and showed me the ropes. He still does." "You've been here a while, then? At the Ayers estate?" He smiled. "Yeah, a while." His face slid through the memories. "I graduated from A&M when I was 24. I've been here ever since." "And how long is ever since?" His gaze came back to her. 5 years. She nodded, doing the math in her head. "And you like it here?" This smile was more wistful than the others. "Yeah, I love it here." The day passed like none had ever passed before for Keith. When the sun got hot, they found a cool shade near the falls and let the kids take a nap. Lying on the ground, Isabella next to her and Peter's hand in hers, Maggie looked like she belonged nowhere else. She never complained, even when he knew she must be uncomfortable having been in the same position too long. Every move she made, every effort, every word came with a question of what was best for the kids clearly in mind. "You're good with them," Keith said when they were both asleep, and he had ambled back over to the little group from his trip to check the horses. "Yeah, well, they're easy to be good with." She twirled one finger through Isabella's curl. Keith sat down and wound his arms around the backs of his knees, which were Indian style under him. "You wouldn't believe the nightmare those two have been through. Those other nannies were—" He exhaled in disgust. "Yeah, I figured as much." Her gaze fell to Peter. "What does that mean?" Maggie's gaze came up to his, and Keith didn't like what he was reading there at all. "The other day, yogurt day, Peter kept cringing away from me like I was going to hit him." Her gaze fell. "I've seen that look before with kids that have grown up being beaten." Real, honest concern swept through him. "You don't think they've ever—" She shrugged slightly. "I wouldn't be surprised the way he was acting, and he's so quiet. He's terrified to get dirty. Any little wiggle throws him into terror." She exhaled. "Lots of signs, lots of pieces, and when you put them all together—" Somehow Keith had never realized this could be a possibility. Yes, the kids weren't treated like kids, but beaten? That wasn't something he'd ever thought was happening to them. "You should have seen him petting the cat the other day," she continued. "It was like he was petting it with one hand and watching out of his eye for the reprimand he knew was coming. They have them on such a tight schedule. You get chewed out for being 2 minutes early. I don't know. They've got everything, you know? The playhouse, the toys, the nice house. But they aren't allowed to be kids." Deep in the middle of his heart at that moment, Keith made the solemn promise to himself that whatever he had to do to keep her here, he would do it. For their sakes. They deserved that much. "Having everything isn't what makes you feel loved," she continued, although his heart already felt like it was overflowing like the falls. It's knowing that you're loved just because you're you." She slid her fingers over Peter's hair. "Every kid deserves that." The words stopped so she could take a breath. "I wish I could give that to every kid alive. Just the solid, unshakable knowledge that they are good enough just the way they are. That they are loved for who they are. Just that much. It could change the world." Had the world quaked out of existence at that very moment, Keith couldn't have moved. Finally, he understood the attraction of her. She cared, not about the money and the cars and the status. She cared about the person. "Well, I for one hope you get that chance," he said softly. Her gaze slid up to his, and she smiled gratefully. It was the most perfect moment of his life. "It's about time you get back," Ike said, stepping up as Keith put Buck into his stall. Instinctively, Maggie backed away without really moving. She cradled Isabella a bit closer and reached down to shield Peter as well. "I took the day off, I told you that," Keith said, and there was a bite to his words. "Well, the operation didn't. Hodges' truck showed up, and they only have half the load." Not really understanding, but wanting to not get in the way just the same, Maggie shrank back. If she could have thought of a way to get the kids back to the mansion without riding in the pickup, she would have done it. Keith exhaled. "Fine." He turned to her slightly. "This'll just take a minute." "No problem," she said so softly she wasn't sure he'd heard. Keith and Ike started to the office, and Maggie followed with the kids, very cautiously and hanging back as much as possible. She considered telling him they would wait in the pickup, but he and Ike were in a heated discussion, and she didn't want to break in and add more stress to the already tense situation. At the office, Keith yanked the door open and stomped inside. Ike followed him, but stood at the door with it open. Maggie, careful to shield the children, stood 10 steps back and faded against the shadows next to the hard, gray wood of the barn. She could hear the angry voices rising as the tension stretched over them.
"Maggie, why is Keith so mad?"
Peter asked at her knee. "Shh," she said, pulling him closer. "Don't worry, they're just trying to get some things settled. How do you explain something you don't even understand?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Ayer," the young driver said, backing past Ike out of the office door. "It won't happen again." "You're darn right it won't happen again. Tell Hodges we get jerked around one more time like this, and we'll find a different supplier permanently." Keith whacked the clipboard into the young man's chest. "You understand that?" "Oh, yes, sir, Mr. Ayer. I'll tell him." "Good. Now get off my property." The words spun through Maggie's brain in a whirlwind of concern and incomprehension. Mr. Ayer? Why did he keep calling Keith that? And why had Ike let Keith handle that when he was obviously the most senior of the two? Mr. Ayer. Mr. Ayer. The name twisted through her, and she pulled Peter closer to her, trying to make time run backward, even as she swayed under the reordering of the world around her. "They'll do it again," Ike said, when the young man was gone. He put one hand on his hip where his brown belt went through the loops, just so. "I know they will." Keith looked so mad Maggie wasn't sure what he would do next. "Get Mac on the line and tell him we'll start buying from them on Friday. Then call Hodges and tell him they're out." The glance that Ike sent in her direction did nothing to settle Maggie's nerves, which were in knots inside her. "What about your dad?" "Let me worry about Dad. He doesn't have to put up with his junk every day like we do. Friends don't jerk friends around like that. Hodges just barked up the wrong tree." Keith stomped back into the office, and Ike followed. Once inside, the voices were too indistinct to make out, and with her head pressed against the barn wall, Maggie fought to block them out altogether. Keith was Mr. Ayer's son. Mr. Ayer, Conrad Ayer, was Keith's father. Her breathing became shallow to the point of being non-existent as her heart broke through that understanding. Slowly, her mind traced through the last week. Over and over again, she had humiliated herself in front of the boss's son. She had leaned on him when her own stupidity caught up with her. Worse, she had told him things you didn't tell people who could get you fired. She felt like the biggest idiot on the planet. Her eyes fell closed against the thoughts. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Tears came to her eyes, stinging and harsh, but she beat them back. Sniffing, she squared her shoulders. He must think she was the most gullible imbecile to grace the planet. Yeah, right, he worked so hard out here. What a joke. He was the crown prince of $1 billion estate. At that moment, the voices approached the door, and Maggie sucked in the emotions swirling around her. She wouldn't let him win. He would never know that she hadn't known. More than that, she would never let him so close again. He was Keith Ayer. She was the hired hand, and for her heart and her sanity, not to mention her job, she'd better remember that. "I'll be up at the mansion till morning," Keith said to Ike, who followed him out. At the office door, Ike stopped, holding the door open with his back. "Dad and Vivian will be back bright and early tomorrow." His voice had a hard edge to it that pulled up fear in Maggie's chest, and it wasn't only her. Peter's fingers dug into her jeans in a crunch. Isabella whimpered at her chest, and Maggie pulled her closer. "Shh, little one, shh." "Maggie, you ready?" Keith asked, looking past Ike. "Oh, yeah." Her voice cracked, and she shook her head in aggravation at herself. He turned in the direction of the pickup, and Maggie stepped that direction as well. When she passed Ike, he looked at her with a mix of disgust and revulsion she couldn't miss. She ducked her head, lest he see the tears in her eyes. Hurt piled over hurt the farther she walked. When they walked out of the barn, and she saw Keith standing at the truck, her heart cracked in two. She closed her eyes and then pulled them back open, fighting the hurt with everything in her. "We'd better get back. I've got to get the kids a bath before dinner. They smell like horse." At her side, Maggie opened her door, and then Isabella's, but Peter never moved from her knee. "Patty Ann will toss me out on my ear if she gets wind of them." "Pete, come over here," Keith said, his anger dissipated. But Peter was going nowhere. Quickly, Maggie latched Isabella in, and then took hold of Peter's hand. Around the back of the pickup she strode, purposefully raking the hair out of her face. On his side, Keith stood solidly by his door, waiting for Peter. However, Maggie never gave him the chance to do so much as touch the child. "I'll get it." He backed into the space of his door, but only that. She didn't care. Anger snapped through the hurt, and at the moment, that was a far better choice. At least that way she didn't have to worry about crying in front of him and completely humiliating herself. When Peter was latched, she reached up and ruffled his hair. "Good boy." Then she stepped back and slammed the door. "What are you standing around for? You want Patty Ann to fire me?" Keith seemed not to have a good answer for that as he stared at her in concerned incredulousness. "No, why would I want that?" Maggie swallowed every word she wanted to yell at him. Instead, she stomped around the front of the truck and got in on her side. On his, Keith got in too. He started the pickup and backed out. All the way home, she felt his gaze chance on her every so often, but she kept hers planted outside the side window. If she just kept her distance, tomorrow would be here in no time, and by tomorrow, she was sure she would never have to worry about getting too close to him again. Once he told them everything he knew, she would never again be welcome at the Ayer mansion. Of that much, she was 100% positive. She was mad, furious, livid. That much Keith was absolutely sure. Why? He was having trouble getting his brain to figure out. Okay, so he'd lost his temper at the stables. Surely she wasn't so naive as to think you could never get angry. After all, he did run a multi-million-dollar operation. That meant he had to make some decisions, and that sometimes things needed a serious adjusting, like Hodges and his manipulations. That was one that needed rectified in a flat hurry. When they pulled up to the house, Keith barely had a chance to get Peter out of the back before she was around the pickup to get him. Whatever had happened to their nice day together had been soul-splittingly triumphant in ruining everything. Maggie wouldn't even look at him. Everything in him wanted to make her look at him like she didn't want to jump off the side of the earth to get away from him. "I'll be back for dinner." Whatever. It was all he would get as she turned and stomped up the steps. Consternation such that he had never felt crashed around him. She acted like she hated him, but only an hour before, they were under the tree watching the kids sleep. The aggravating issue stayed with him the rest of the afternoon and through dinner, during which she hardly said 2 words and never so much as looked at him, and right through her taking the kids upstairs. He had never felt so panicked in his life. Whatever it was major, and the question of why she had done such a drastic 180 kept drifting through him. At first he wrote it off to mood swings, but when he was in his room later, his thoughts fought to put the whole puzzle together, and no matter how hard he tried, it just didn't fit. Finally, although it was taking his life in his hands, he knew he had to go ask. His heart slammed into his chest, warning him that this might make it worse, but in truth, he couldn't see how it could get any worse. Quietly, he left his side of the mansion and made his way to hers. The soft light of the hallway nightlight guided his steps until he was standing at Peter's door. Keith pushed it in slightly, not wanting to disturb their already-in-progress ritual. "And please help us have a good day tomorrow," Maggie prayed, her head down, bending over Peter's bed. Keith heard the struggle in her voice, and he knew without a doubt that she was worried about the coming morning. He wasn't looking forward to it either. If things could just stay like this, he would be perfectly content to live here forever. Guide us, protect us, keep us, help us, and love us. Amen. There was a soft rustle of blankets.
I love you, Maggie.
The words drifted to Keith, and he peered in. Peter was in her arms, hugging her like he never wanted to let her go. "I love you too, little one." The hug lasted a few more moments, and then she pulled him away. "Now, you get some sleep." She pushed to her feet and stopped. Softly, she kissed her 2 fingers, and then pressed them to his forehead. "Good night, little prince. Sleep well." Even after she was finished, she didn't move for a long moment, and out of respect for her privacy, Keith backed out into the hallway to wait for her. When she came out, he heard the sniffle and felt the anguish pouring from her even though he couldn't clearly see her face. In the soft light, she shut the door before wiping her eyes and letting out a long, slow breath. "Maggie?" he said softly, and she jumped a foot and spun to face him. Her face fell into a glowering distrust, even though he was leaning against the wall, not exactly poised to pounce on her. Bitterness scrawled across her face as she turned slightly away from him. "What do you want?" "Can we talk?" Head down, she headed across the hall to her door. "We don't have anything to talk about." He pushed away from the wall and stepped over to her door. There, he again leaned against the wall and lowered his head so he could look at her. "I think we do." She shook her head and reached for her doorknob. "It's late. I need to get to bed." Gently, he reached out and touched her wrist, praying she wouldn't leave. "Maggie, please. I know you're mad, and I want to know why." "I'm not mad." She shook her hair back defiantly and looked at him. Chin up, that unmistakable air of determination flowing through every fiber of her. Why would I be mad? The middle of him ached with the hate in her eyes. "I don't know. Why are you?" Her gaze broke from his and darted across the hall. "Look, I get it, okay? I know the score. It took me a while, but you don't have to worry. I get it now." Concerned incomprehension traced through him. "Maggie, you're not making any sense. What are you talking about?" When she smiled at him, there was nothing in him that liked it. She looked cold and hateful and detached. "You're the prince of Conrad Ayer Industries. My bad. I thought you were just a nice guy who cared." The words hit him like punches, and he dropped his hand from her wrist. You didn't know." With her jaw set, she shook her head. "No, and you didn't bother to tell me that little detail either." His head dropped as understanding poured through him. No wonder she'd seemed so unnaturally normal around him. That explained a lot. Too much, really. He sighed that understanding into his heart. "I'm sorry, really I am. I assumed you knew." "No, I didn't know." Abhorrence and hurt dripped from the statement. Her gaze dropped from him to the carpet. "Well, you got what you wanted. Congratulations. Mission accomplished." Panic plowed into him. "What does that mean?" "Oh, come on, Keith. I'm not stupid. I know a spy when I see one." That punch just about leveled him. "What? A spy? I wasn't spying on you." She laced her arms over themselves. "Oh, yeah? Then why have you been hanging around all week? Why have you been asking me about my past? Why have you watched my every move with the kids, even coming up here at night to check on us?" She put air quote marks around the last 3 words with her fingers. "I'm not completely stupid, you know." Hurt and hate bled through her gaze. "I just hope you can explain it to Pete and Izzy when I'm gone tomorrow, because they're going to be crushed, thanks to you. Not that you ever really cared anyway." That one brought his defenses up. "Okay, now that's not fair. You know I love those 2. "Yeah, so you say. But how do I know that's the truth? How do I know anything you say is the truth?" With determination, he turned full on her. "Okay, that's it. Look at me." When she didn't, he put his hands on her shoulders and turned her to face him. "I said, look at me, Maggie." Her gaze met his, but there wasn't an ounce of trust anywhere in them. "I love those 2 kids like they were my own. I don't like what's been happening to them any more than you do, and despite what you think about me, I do not want you to leave. I have not been spying. Watching, yes. Spying, no. Now, you can hate me forever, that's fine. But don't you dare use that as an excuse to leave them, because they need you more than you can know." "Oh, yeah? Well, what about your dad and Mrs. Ayer? They'll be back tomorrow, and I'm pretty sure Patty Ann and Inez will have plenty of stories to relate when they get back." She set her mouth. "Let's face it, like it or not, I'll be out tomorrow." His hands dropped from her shoulders, and he leaned back against the wall. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do, and so do you." Her head fell to the side. "I may be what the kids need, but I'm sure not what the parents want. I knew that the first day. It's only a matter of time now, even if they don't fire me outright tomorrow." The thought of her leaving, driving away, never coming back, stabbed through him like a twin-edged sword. "I'm sorry. I really am." "Yeah, well, it was an impressive show while it lasted. That whole working out of the stables thing, you sure had me fooled." He felt like he'd gone 16 rounds with a heavyweight champion of the world. Even his breath was gone. "That wasn't a show. I really do work out there." "Yeah, I'm sure, and it's such hard work, too." Her sarcasm bit through him, taking his knees out from under him. He slid down the wall, hearing in her voice exactly what every other person he'd ever met believed about him. She stood there, over him, arms intertwined, ready to kick him once more with her words if she hadn't finished him off already. He could feel her gaze, but the numbness of hurt gripping him wouldn't let him look at her. She hated him, and he didn't blame her. "I really do work," he said softly to the air in front of him. "I know, that's hard to believe." He shook his head and let it fall back onto the wall, so he was looking at the top corner of the opposite side of the hall. I don't know. Maybe that's not even really true. You're probably right. I'm just a spoiled little rich kid who wouldn't know what hard work was if it bit him in the butt. The inescapable truth of his lousy excuse for an existence cracked over him, and his spirit plummeted. He had tried so hard to prove to everyone that he wasn't just Daddy's little puppet, that he was his own man, that he could make it on his own. What a joke! She saw through that sham as surely as everyone else did. The feelings of worthlessness clogged the top of his chest, and for the first time in his life, he let them come. She hated him almost as much as he hated himself, and that was saying something. Then, slowly, gently, he felt her not leave, but bend down next to him, and this time her gaze was soft. I'm sorry. That really was uncalled for. I shouldn't have said that. A smile of sad acceptance slipped through him. No, you just said what everyone else is thinking, except they don't have the guts to say it to my face. Her gaze surveyed him as she searched for some way to take back her words and ease the hurt she had caused. He let his head fall to the side so he could look at her. It was over. He might as well finish it off. I'm engaged. And the words snaked through her face slowly, and her hand dropped from his shoulder. What? Their friendship was completely trashed now. There was no reason not to burn it all the way to the ground. Besides, Keith knew it would be better to kill whatever was left of them now, get it over with in one gut-crushing whack, than to drag it out. That was cruel, and would hurt her more in the end anyway. This way, she didn't have the stupid idea that he was worth getting to know. She would see what a jerk he was and get out while the getting was good. He twisted his lips into a half-smile, half-frown, fighting not to let the words dig into him. His gaze fell to his knuckles, which were sliding back and forth through his palm. Yeah, June 3rd. He nodded without feeling it. Dallas Henderson, Lowell Henderson's daughter. Her eyes widened. Lowell Henderson, the senator? That's the one. Keith exhaled hard. She'll be here Saturday. Big, huge bash to celebrate the engagement. All the most powerful people in Texas, that kind of thing. It's the wedding of the decade, or so I'm told. Carefully, Maggie let herself down onto the carpet next to him and leaned her back on her bedroom door. It took more than a minute for her to respond. And this is a good thing, right? As strange as that sounded, she actually sounded concerned, as if she cared one way or the other. Of course it's a good thing. The words came with firmness, and he was glad for that. It's just, I should have told you sooner. Her gaze did a little circle dance until she let her head crack back on the door. Well, I wish you would have, but I understand why you didn't. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she let her gaze fall over to his. Is she nice? He nodded slowly, but never looked at her. Good, she said, and he heard the feelings lacing the sides of that single word. You deserve nice.
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.
This has been Deep in the Heart, written by Staci Stallings. Narrated by Becky Dowdy of Brave Hearts Audiobook Productions. Copyright 2010 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.